The moment that courtroom doors creaked open, Meghan Markle's carefully constructed fairy tale didn't just wobble, it cracked loudly, violently, and in a way the palace could never quietly fix again, because suddenly, buried inside a $157 million inheritance war across the Atlantic, a centuries old, law whispered a question so dangerous, so explosive, it threatened to drag her most fiercely protected secret into the cold, unforgiving light, and Prince William, the future king himself, had already drawn the line.
Did Buckingham Palace or Prince William set a trap for Prince Harry and Meghan Markle, and were they gullible enough to fall into it?
He's had enough. He wants to clean the monarchy, and it's all now in the hands of the courts. Meghan Markle is in full mode panic along with Harry because they both know what they did.
The stories would come out. So apparently, according to other journalists, we found out that there were a lot of porcupines probably told to the royals and even to Harry when they met her, and in order to cover up.
It's actually torture to listen to that woman now, because every other word out of her mouth is a lie.
Prince William just drew a line in the sand, and it runs straight through Meghan Markle's maternity ward story, and the timing was not coincidence, it was collision. Because while Meghan was busy curating glossy motherhood moments, posting carefully angled hospital videos, crafting the image of a modern royal mother in control, something far more ancient and far more ruthless was waking up inside a courtroom thousands of miles away. And it didn't care about Instagram filters or brand management, it cared about blood, law, and legitimacy. This wasn't gossip anymore. This was constitutional territory. And Meghan wasn't prepared for the law to start asking questions she had spent 6 years aggressively avoiding.
Maybe King Charles didn't want to do anything about it, given what's going on with Andrew, but in order for William to save the monarchy, he has to deal with the Archie and Lilibet problem.
A $157 million inheritance fight, a surrogate-born aristocratic heir, and a brutal reminder of a legal phrase that has ruled royal bloodlines like an invisible tyrant since 1701, born of the body. 4 simple words. 4 devastating words. Words that built monarchies and destroyed them. Words that suddenly became radioactive the moment they collided with the Sussex timeline. Because if those words didn't apply, if even one technicality unraveled the story the world had been told, then this wasn't just about inheritance money anymore. This was about the very foundation of who could stand in line for the throne itself.
They think her kids are fake. They think they're AI.
I'm going to quote Tom Bauer by saying, he said, look, we all laughed at Samantha and she was right, and everything she said has come true.
Just days ago, one of the most explosive legal confessions in modern aristocratic history slipped into public record almost unnoticed, but those who were paying attention immediately felt the shockwave. The Marquis of Bath, walking calmly into Bristol's High Court, did something Meghan has never done. He admitted the truth. His son, born via surrogacy, might not legally qualify as heir under centuries-old inheritance law. He didn't hide. He didn't threaten journalists. He didn't deploy lawyers to silence discussion. He acknowledged reality, and the law responded with cold indifference. Because under those ancient definitions, biology wasn't enough. Love wasn't enough. Only one thing mattered: born of the body.
Never put an article out there that Meghan had a hysterectomy and couldn't have children, and that was a big issue in their relationship. So that says a lot to the fake royal kids right now, because obviously they couldn't have come out of her. So that's something that she obviously is going to have to deal with.
$157 million hanging in the balance. A fortune frozen in legal uncertainty because of a legal phrase older than electricity itself. And suddenly, a terrifying possibility emerged, not for the Marquis, but for Meghan, because the exact same principle governs royal succession. The same words, the same brutal clarity, no exceptions, no reinterpretations, no emotional appeals, just cold constitutional arithmetic. The judge didn't hesitate. He stated clearly that uncertainty existed about whether the surrogate-born child qualified as beneficiary. Uncertainty. That single word echoed like thunder through aristocratic bloodlines. And somewhere in Montecito, that word hit like a warning siren. Because if uncertainty could freeze a $157 million inheritance, what could it do to royal titles? To royal legitimacy? To royal history itself? This is where everything stopped being theoretical and became dangerously personal. Because the royal line of succession doesn't operate on vibes or storytelling, it operates on documentation, witnesses, verification. For over 300 years, every royal birth followed the same ritual. Doctors signed notices. Officials witnessed arrivals. Proof existed, undeniable and immediate. It wasn't about privacy, it was about legitimacy. The crown doesn't survive on secrecy. It survives on certainty. And yet when Archie was born, that certainty vanished. No witnesses, no traditional sign-offs, no hospital step photo call, no immediate verification, just silence and vague statements and carefully controlled appearances that raised more questions than answers. And the public noticed. Of course they did. Because royal births weren't just family moments, they were constitutional events. William and Catherine stood proudly outside St. Mary's Hospital hours after each birth, presenting their children to the world with confidence. There was no hesitation, no delay, no mystery, because they had nothing to hide. But Meghan and Harry chose a different path, a path of privacy so absolute it bordered on secrecy, a path that broke every precedent. And people began to whisper. The pregnancy question wasn't conspiracy, it was procedural, because in royal succession, proof isn't optional, it's foundational. And Meghan's story didn't follow the rules. Archie's birth lacked traditional verification. The timeline felt compressed. Harry's own account described leaving the hospital astonishingly fast, faster than any royal birth in modern memory, faster than the palace could even officially announce labor had begun. It wasn't just unusual, it was unprecedented. And unprecedented events create unprecedented suspicion. Harry's descriptions only deepened the mystery. Electric candles, spiritual rituals, private moments, intimate details that felt less like constitutional documentation and more like a carefully curated lifestyle narrative. And people began to ask the question no one wanted asked out loud: why avoid the simplest proof if everything was normal? Because historically, royal births were never private matters. They were public certainties, witnessed, verified, recorded, protected against doubt. Because doubt is the one thing a monarchy cannot afford. Doubt is poison to legitimacy. Doubt destroys authority faster than scandal ever could. And now, Prince William was watching closely because he understood something Meghan may have underestimated. The crown cannot afford ambiguity. Not now, not ever. Every unanswered question becomes a future crisis. Every shadow becomes a future scandal. Every uncertainty becomes a future threat to stability. And William wasn't reacting emotionally. He was reacting strategically, quietly distancing the monarchy's institutional identity from potential controversy, carefully reinforcing legitimacy, methodically protecting the crown he would one day inherit. Because unlike Meghan, William wasn't building a brand. He was preserving a 1,000-year institution. And the timing couldn't have been worse for Meghan. Because the Marquis of Bath case had just done something irreversible, it had transformed speculation into legal precedent. It proved the law still mattered. It proved ancient definitions still applied. It proved the phrase born of the body wasn't symbolic, it was operational, real, enforceable. And suddenly, Meghan's carefully managed narrative faced a terrifying possibility. Because if the law could question an aristocrat's heir, it could question anyone's. And the silence from Montecito only made everything louder. Because silence in situations like this doesn't calm suspicion, it feeds it. The most chilling part of this entire unfolding storm wasn't what was being said in public, it was what wasn't being said at all. Because inside the palace walls, behind the polished smiles and carefully worded statements, Prince William had already begun preparing for a future where unanswered questions could no longer be tolerated, where the monarchy could no longer afford to carry secrets like unexploded landmines beneath its own foundation, and those close to him knew exactly why. Because William had lived through what happens when silence festers into scandal, when the truth hides too long in the shadows and eventually erupts with enough force to damage everything in its path, and he refused to let that cycle repeat under his reign. He wasn't panicking, he wasn't reacting impulsively, he was doing something far more dangerous. He was waiting, watching, and letting the law do what it always does eventually, which is expose everything that doesn't belong in the light. And that's what made Meghan's situation so precarious, because unlike tabloid rumors or internet speculation, legal precedent doesn't care about reputation management. It doesn't care about brand narratives, and it certainly doesn't care about carefully curated Netflix documentaries or emotional interviews. It cares about facts, documents, and definitions written in ink centuries before Meghan Markle was ever born. And now those definitions were suddenly alive again, breathing down the neck of every unanswered question surrounding Archie and Lilibet's births, forcing people at the highest levels of royal authority to confront a possibility they had spent years avoiding, that uncertainty itself was becoming the real threat, because uncertainty creates vulnerability, and vulnerability invites challenge, and challenge, when it reaches constitutional territory, becomes impossible to ignore. Behind the scenes, insiders whispered that William had grown increasingly frustrated, not because of personal anger, but because of institutional risk, because every vague timeline, every missing verification, every unanswered procedural question represented a future crisis waiting to erupt. And he knew that when he became king, he would inherit not just the crown, but every unanswered question attached to it. He couldn't afford ambiguity. He couldn't afford loopholes. He couldn't afford narratives that relied on trust instead of proof. And this is where Meghan's carefully constructed independence became her greatest vulnerability, because by separating from the royal system, by choosing privacy over protocol, she had also separated herself from the institutional mechanisms designed to protect legitimacy. And now, without those safeguards, everything rested on trust alone, and trust, once fractured, is almost impossible to fully restore. People began connecting dots they had ignored for years, revisiting timelines, comparing statements, analyzing the unusual secrecy that surrounded both births, and what once seemed like minor irregularities began to look like pieces of a larger puzzle, a puzzle that Meghan's legal team had aggressively tried to keep scattered and unassembled, issuing warnings, threatening consequences, and ensuring that no single narrative could gain enough traction to force official clarification. But the Marquis of Bath case changed everything, because it proved something devastatingly simple: the law was still capable of questioning legitimacy, even in modern times, even in elite families, even in situations where everyone assumed tradition had quietly adapted to modern reality. It hadn't. It was still there, still rigid, still absolute. And that realization sent a wave of unease through royal observers, historians, and insiders who understood exactly what it meant. Because if the law could pause a 157 million inheritance over surrogacy definitions, then theoretically it could question succession placements too. And even the possibility of that scenario was enough to make palace officials deeply uncomfortable. Meanwhile, Meghan's public image continued projecting confidence, control, and detachment. But those watching closely noticed subtle shifts: fewer references, fewer detailed discussions, fewer opportunities for direct questions, as if her team understood that every word now carried legal weight, that every statement could one day be examined not as narrative but as evidence. And Prince William, watching all of this unfold, didn't need to say anything publicly, because his silence carried its own message, a message of preparation, of readiness, of a future king determined to inherit certainty, not confusion. He had already begun reshaping the monarchy's operational boundaries, reinforcing protocols, strengthening institutional clarity, ensuring that when his reign began, there would be no room for interpretation, no room for doubt, no room for stories that relied on belief instead of verification. Because William understood the most dangerous truth of all: the monarchy doesn't collapse from scandal. It collapses from uncertainty about legitimacy, and legitimacy is built on proof, not perception. And now Meghan and Harry found themselves trapped in the worst possible position: not accused, not charged, but questioned. And questions, unlike accusations, never fully disappear until they are answered with undeniable clarity. Their silence, once a shield, had become a spotlight, magnifying every inconsistency, every missing detail, every deviation from precedent. And the longer that silence continued, the more people began to assume it existed for a reason. Because in royal history, transparency has always been the ultimate weapon against doubt, and secrecy has always been its greatest ally. And as the legal world continued digesting the implications of the Marquis case, one thing became impossible to ignore: the ancient laws were still watching, still waiting, still ready to assert themselves whenever legitimacy came into question, and for the first time since Archie's birth. Those laws didn't feel like distant relics. They felt immediate, relevant, and potentially explosive. Meghan had built her identity on reinvention, on rewriting narratives, on controlling perception with extraordinary precision. But constitutional law isn't perception, it's permanence, and permanence doesn't bend easily. Somewhere in Montecito, behind the gates, behind the cameras, behind the carefully constructed image of calm control, the reality of that permanence had begun to settle in. Because once the law begins asking questions, it never stops until it finds answers. And Prince William, standing at the edge of his future reign, understood exactly what was at stake: not revenge, not personal conflict, but the survival of an institution built on bloodlines that cannot afford to leave legitimacy open to interpretation. And now, whether Meghan wanted it or not, whether Harry liked it or not, whether the palace acknowledged it publicly or not, the question had already escaped into the world. And once a question like that escapes, It never goes back into hiding. It waits patiently, relentlessly, until the truth, whatever it may be, finally catches up.